Hey everyone. I know you've all been watching the economy, and I mean, it's easy to get overwhelmed, right? Like with the market dips and recession talk and unemployment ticking up. So today, let's do a deep dive into it all.
Using that interview you sent over with Dr. Lawrence Reed,
Yeah.
the economist historian.
Yeah, he's got a really valuable perspective, especially now, I think, because he's not just looking at numbers.
Yeah.
He sees the bigger picture, how economics and history and world events and even our own choices all kind of tie together.
Yeah, he's a pretty big name in economics, right? I mean, president of the Foundation for Economic Education.
Hmm?
And wow, he even got Poland's highest honor, the same one they gave to Ronald Reagan.
Seriously impressive credentials. And this interview, like, he covers it all. Global markets, oil prices,
Yeah.
U.S. economic policy. Oh, and get this, he even compares stuff to the fall of Rome.
Wow. Okay, so a lot to unpack there. So we're going to try to break down like his key insights and figure out what's really going on in the economy and more importantly, what it means for you and me.
Exactly. Like, let's untangle it all so you come away with a clearer view of what's happening.
Okay, so first thing that really struck me was Dr. Reed's take on the markets. You know how everyone's jittery. He acknowledges the economic slowdown for sure, but he says there's something else spooking investors, something beyond just the numbers.
Yeah, he's talking about, those rising geopolitical tensions,
Right.
especially that potential conflict between Iran and Israel. All that uncertainty, it's like a ripple effect.
Hmm.
It's making investors nervous.
And it's not just like a side comment. He points to specific things, like those calls for Israel to target Iranian oil refineries and suggests like that could have huge impacts on oil prices globally.
Totally. Not just some theoretical thing either. Like if things escalate, say the Strait of Hormuz gets blocked, oil tankers are stuck, we'd see prices spike like crazy. Imagine gas well over $100 a barrel.
Yeah, ouch.
Mm.
That would hit everyone's wallets hard. I mean, filling my tank's bad enough already. But this leads to another thing. Dr. Reed brings up U.S. energy policy. He is not a fan of how the Biden administration's handling it. He says the U.S. could be like the Saudi Arabia of oil, but our own policies are holding us back.
He's really skeptical about the whole push for electric vehicles, too. He says the infrastructure just isn't there, even with all the government money going to charging stations. Apparently, only a tiny fraction of the planned stations have actually been built, even with billions in spending.
So even if we all wanted to switch to electric cars tomorrow, we couldn't. There just aren't enough places to plug in, and it doesn't sound like they're being built fast enough either.
Exactly. And what's scary is that while we're like holding back our own oil production, we're making ourselves more vulnerable to those global price shocks we talked about.
Right. So if that Iran situation blows up
Yeah,
and we're not producing enough oil ourselves, doesn't that make a recession even worse?
definitely a real concern. And it shows how connected everything is,
Yeah.
global events and what we do here at home. But speaking of things that could worsen a recession, Dr. Reed has a really stark warning about U.S. debt. He calls it a ticking time bomb.
Yeah, he doesn't sugarcoat it, does he?
No, he's very clear about the difference between good debt, like investing stuff that'll make money later,
Yeah.
and bad debt, which is what it feels like the U.S. is doing now.
Right.
Borrowing tons of money just to cover spending.
So for our listeners, think of it like this. Taking a loan to start a business that'll hopefully be successful, that's kind of like good debt. But
Mm.
racking up credit card bills for stuff you can't afford, that's the bad kind. Eventually, you got to pay up.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And yeah, it seems like the U.S. is doing a lot of that bad borrowing.
Hmm.
And the interview mentions how in 2022, 11.5% of Americans were living in poverty, getting by on like $24, $25 a day.
It's a scary thought, especially when you think about how all this debt could impact people who are already struggling. If that debt bomb explodes like Dr. Reed says, could things get even worse for the most vulnerable?
It's a question worth thinking about. And it leads to another fascinating point Dr. Reed makes. He draws some pretty interesting parallels between the U.S. and the fall of the Roman Republic. It might seem a little out there at first, but he makes a really good case. You know how both the U.S. and Rome, they came out of these revolts against monarchy, right? Like founded on the idea of limited government and power spread out.
So both were born from this desire to get away from concentrated power,
Mm.
create systems where authority is more distributed. It's a really interesting parallel. But then he adds this twist, right? He says Rome eventually fell for some temptations that sound pretty familiar.
Right. He highlights a bunch of factors that led to Rome's decline.
Yeah,
And
that's
some of
true.
them, yeah, they sound eerily familiar. He talks about the appeal of the welfare state, the drain of those expensive foreign wars, and maybe the biggest one, the erosion of personal character.
So breaking that down, when he talks about the welfare state, is he talking about something like our social safety net today?
Exactly. Programs to help people in need are definitely important. But he seems to be warning against like expanding government assistance too much. you know? Like it could backfire.
And it's not just about the government running out of money, right? He seems to be saying there's a deeper problem.
Yeah, he connects it to that erosion of character thing. A healthy republic, he says, depends on people being self-reliant, responsible, and involved in civic life. If everyone gets too dependent on the government or too focused on just their own stuff, it weakens society as a whole.
So too much reliance on government handouts. It creates this complacency and undermines the self-reliance a republic needs to thrive.
That's the core of his argument. And talking about burdens on the government, he also compares Rome getting involved in expensive foreign conflicts to, well, our own history.
He's not exactly shying away from controversy, is he? I mean, we've definitely had our fair share of wars lately.
His point is that these wars, no matter how they start, they put a huge strain on a country's resources, money and people. They can take attention away from problems at home and add to that mountain of debt we were talking about.
Sounds kind of bleak. Is there any hope in his view?
He's not totally pessimistic. He thinks we can still turn things around. But it needs what he calls re-educating people.
Re-educating? What does he mean by that?
He means focusing again on the principles of liberty, limited government, and personal responsibility. Like going back to the basics, what the U.S. was founded on, and actually Rome, too, back in the good old days.
So not about forcing some new ideology, but rediscovering the values that these republics were built on.
Exactly. And a big part of that is self-reliance. He thinks depending on politicians for handouts just leads to disappointment. We should be focused on building our own skills, creating value, contributing to society.
Empowering ourselves. Recognizing that we have the power to shape our own lives and communities. I remember when I first moved out on my own and I was like determined to do everything myself. I even tried to fix my leaky faucet. It's like a YouTube tutorial. It was a total disaster. But, I learned a lot. And then when I finally called a plumber, I actually understood what he was talking about.
Yeah. It's funny how those DIY fails stick with you. There's definitely something about facing those challenges head on, building that self-reliance.
Yeah.
And that seems to be Dr. Reed's whole message. It's about individual empowerment. He even talks about his own life. Remember, he got Poland's highest honor for all his work promoting free markets and individual liberty.
It's true. He really practices what he preaches. But I keep thinking about the thing he said about the U.S. government being too big. Like it's on autopilot, going in a direction that no one person can control, no matter how good their intentions are.
Yeah. It's a sobering thought, especially with all the stuff we've been talking about, the economy, the energy situation, that huge debt, and those parallels to Rome. It can feel kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
For sure. So if the government's this massive thing that's out of control, does that mean there's no hope for good leadership? Like, does it even matter who's in charge?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Dr. Reed doesn't shy away from it. He seems to be saying that while individual leaders can make a difference, they're stuck in a system that's just become way too complex.
Like he's challenging us to look beyond just politics and deal with the deeper problems.
Exactly. He's calling for a change in how we think. Going back to those ideas of limited government, individual liberty, and personal responsibility.
So what does all this mean for our listeners? Like, if you're worried about how things are going and want to do something, where do you even start?
Well, Dr. Reed's message is a call to action. He wants us to get involved and shape our own futures, not just sit back and watch, That means having thoughtful discussions, educating ourselves about these complicated issues, and holding our leaders accountable.
He's saying change starts with each of us, taking responsibility and realizing we have the power to make a difference, even in small ways.
And maybe those small actions, they can create a ripple effect and lead to bigger changes down the line.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening for me. Dr. Reed's views on the economy, energy debt, and the lessons we can learn from history, they've given me a lot to think about. But more than that, his message about taking action and getting back to basic principles, it's left me feeling strangely hopeful.
I think that's the key takeaway. The challenges are real, but we're not helpless. We can choose to be informed, get involved, and actively build a better future for ourselves and for everyone who comes after us.
So to all of you listening, we leave you with this. What will you do to be part of the solution?